At my wife Eleanor's funeral, my son Lucas whispered to his wife about our $60 million estate. "Don't expect a dime from Mom's money. It's already mine." He had no idea I was standing close enough to hear every calculated word. Soon after, we gathered in the lawyer's office for the will reading that Lucas thought would make him rich. But when the attorney read the first line aloud, my son's face went completely white, and his wife stormed out without saying a word. Before we continue, hit subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. The mahogany casket gleamed under the church's amber light, and I stood beside it with my hands folded, watching the last of the mourners file past Eleanor's still form. 47 years of marriage, and now she lay there in her favorite blue dress, the one she wore to our anniversary dinner just 3 months ago. The scent of lilies hung heavy in the air, mixing with the old wood polish that had soaked into these pews for decades. Lucas stood 3 feet away from me, close enough that anyone watching would see a grieving son supporting his father. His dark suit was perfectly pressed, his expression appropriately solemn. Madison, his wife of 8 years, clutched his arm with manicured fingers, her black dress expensive enough to cost more than most people's monthly salary. They made a handsome couple, the kind that graced charity event photos in the society pages. Yet something about their proximity to Eleanor's casket felt wrong, like vultures circling before the meal was properly finished. I adjusted my tie and tried to push the uncharitable thought away. "She was such a generous woman," Mrs. Henderson from next door whispered to her husband as they approached the casket. "Always contributing to the children's hospital, remember?" Her husband nodded, dabbing his eyes with a handkerchief that had seen better days. Eleanor had indeed been generous. Sometimes to a fault, I thought. She never could say no to a worthy cause, never could turn away someone in need. It was one of the things I loved most about her, and perhaps one of the things that worried me most about what would come next. The estate she'd built through decades of careful investments and wise decisions was substantial, more substantial than most people realized. The organ music swelled softly, signaling that the service would soon begin, and people began settling into their seats. I remained standing beside the casket, my hand resting on the polished wood, when Lucas leaned close to Madison's ear. His voice was barely above a whisper, but in the hush of the church, with my hearing still sharp despite my age, every word reached me clearly. $60 million, he said, his tone carrying a weight that made my stomach tighten. "And Dad's too old to handle it. He'll slip up." Madison's response came with a small, almost imperceptible smirk that transformed her perfectly composed features into something colder. "He already looks lost," she murmured back, her gaze flicking toward me with an assessment that felt clinical, predatory. "We'll make sure nothing goes to charity." The way she said charity made it sound like a dirty word, something distasteful that needed to be eliminated. The pastor began calling everyone to take their seats, his voice gentle, but carrying enough authority to move the lingering crowd. Lucas straightened, adjusting his cufflinks with the same deliberate precision he'd shown since childhood when he was about to perform for an audience. Madison smoothed her skirt and touched her pearl necklace, a gesture I'd noticed she made when she was particularly pleased about something. They moved toward the front pew, the one reserved for family, and Lucas placed his hand on my shoulder with what anyone watching would interpret as filial support. "Come on, Dad," he said, his public voice warm with appropriate grief. "Let's sit down." But his fingers pressed just a little too hard, and I could still hear the echo of his whispered words about $60 million. The house felt different when we returned from the cemetery, as if Eleanor's absence had somehow changed the very air inside. People filled the living room and kitchen, their voices creating a low hum of conversation punctuated by the occasional laugh. I moved through the rooms mechanically, playing the role of grieving widower and gracious host, accepting condolences with nods and quiet thank yous. The casserole dishes and flower arrangements seemed to multiply on every available surface, offerings from neighbors and friends who meant well, but didn't know what else to do with their sympathy. Eleanor would have known exactly how to organize all of this, would have had everyone fed and comfortable without breaking a sweat. Mrs. Patterson from the garden club was telling someone about Eleanor's prize-winning roses, her voice carrying the kind of fondness that comes from years of genuine friendship. Mr. Davis from the hardware store was explaining to a group how Eleanor had always known exactly which screws she needed for her various projects around the house. These were the people who had known my wife as she really was, not as a bank account or an inheritance to be claimed. I reached for the coffee pot to refill cups. The ceramic handle was warm against my palm, and I could hear the soft conversations continuing in the living room. People sharing memories, offering support, doing what communities do when they lose someone who mattered. But from somewhere deeper in the house, from the direction of Eleanor's small office where she used to pay bills and manage her charitable contributions, I heard Lucas's voice cutting through the gentle murmur of mourning. His tone was different now, sharper, more businesslike than the subdued grief he'd displayed at the church. The coffee pot felt heavier in my hand as I strained to make out his words. "Don't expect a dime from Mom's estate," Lucas was saying, and his voice carried the kind of confidence that comes from someone who believes they hold all the cards. "It's already mine." The hot coffee splashed over the rim of the pot and onto my skin, the burn immediate and sharp, but I didn't let go. I couldn't let go, couldn't move, couldn't even breathe for a moment as the full impact of what I'd heard settled into my chest like a weight. The pain from the coffee was nothing compared to the ache that spread through my ribs. The realization that my son had already divided up his mother's life's work before we'd even finished burying her. The laughter from the living room continued, Mrs. Henderson's voice rising above the others as she told the story about Eleanor and the runaway lawnmower that had become family legend. But standing there in the kitchen with coffee dripping from my burned hand onto the linoleum floor, I felt utterly alone among all these people who had come to honor my wife's memory. Lucas's words echoed in my head, "Already mine," spoken with such casual certainty that it suggested he'd been planning this conversation for some time. The man I'd raised, the boy who used to help Eleanor plant flowers in our garden, had become someone I didn't recognize. Someone who could speak of his mother's death as a business opportunity before the dirt had even settled on her grave. I didn't know then that Eleanor had been 3 steps ahead of us all, or that the will Lucas was so confident about wasn't the only document that would matter in the coming days. Richard Coleman's office sat on the 3rd floor of the old Merchants Building downtown, the same place where Eleanor and I had signed our first mortgage papers 30 years ago. The elevator groaned as it carried me up, each floor marker lighting up with a soft ding that echoed in the cramped space. I hadn't slept well since the funeral 3 days ago, Lucas's words about the estate playing on repeat in my mind like a broken record. The hallway outside Richard's office smelled of old wood and legal documents, that particular scent of paper and leather that accumulates in places where important decisions are made. I paused outside his door, my hand hovering over the brass nameplate that read Coleman and Associates, wondering if I was about to learn something I wasn't prepared to handle. The weight of Eleanor's absence felt heavier here, in this place where we'd planned our future together so many times before. Richard opened the door before I could knock. He was one of the few people who had known Eleanor longer than I had, dating back to their college days when she was studying business and he was working his way through law school. His gray suit hung loose on his frame. He'd lost weight since his wife's passing 2 years ago, but his eyes were sharp as ever behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Henry," he said, stepping aside to let me enter. "I'm glad you came." He gestured toward the leather chair across from his desk, the same one where Eleanor and I had sat when we'd updated our wills 5 years ago. The memory of that day felt both distant and immediate. Eleanor insisting on specific language about her charitable contributions, her careful attention to every detail that I'd attributed to her naturally organized mind. Richard moved to a filing cabinet behind his desk, one that required 2 keys to open, and I watched as he withdrew a thick manila folder that looked different from the standard legal documents I was used to seeing. "Eleanor asked me to have this conversation with you after the funeral," he said, his voice dropping to just above a whisper. She was very specific about the timing. The folder made a soft thud as he placed it on the desk between us, and I could see my wife's handwriting on the tab. "What Lucas knows about the will," Richard said, opening the folder to reveal multiple documents, some typed, some handwritten, "isn't the complete picture." His fingers traced the edge of a document I didn't recognize, one that bore Eleanor's signature but a date from just 3 months before her death. The paper was cream-colored, expensive, the kind she used for important correspondence, and I could see the slight tremor in her handwriting that had developed in her final weeks. "Eleanor planned something different, Henry. What your son believes he'll inherit. It's not the real will." I leaned forward in the chair, my hands gripping the worn leather armrests as I tried to process what he was telling me. The Eleanor I thought I knew, the woman who discussed every major decision with me over morning coffee, had apparently orchestrated something significant without my knowledge. The afternoon light had shifted, casting Richard's face in partial shadow, but I could see the weight of secrets in his eyes, the burden of carrying information that would change everything. "She left instructions," he continued, pulling out what appeared to be a letter written in Eleanor's distinctive script. "She wanted you to read this yourself, in your own time, but she also wanted you to know that she'd been watching Lucas more carefully than anyone realized." The paper rustled as he slid it across the desk toward me, and I could smell the faint lavender scent that Eleanor always used in her personal stationery. My hands trembled slightly as I picked up the letter, seeing my name written across the top in the careful cursive she'd maintained despite her illness. The letter was dated 2 weeks before Eleanor entered the hospital for the last time, and her handwriting, though shaky, was determined and clear. "My dearest Henry," it began, and I could hear her voice in every word as if she were sitting beside me. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and I suspect Lucas has already begun to show his true colors regarding our estate. I have watched our son change over the years, watched him become someone I don't recognize, someone who sees money where he should see family." The words blurred for a moment as my eyes filled, but I forced myself to continue reading. "If Lucas mocks you, if he dismisses you as too old or too frail to understand business, let him. The first line of my real will is going to stop him cold." I looked up at Richard, who was watching me with the patient expression of someone who had seen this revelation play out in his mind many times already. I folded the letter carefully, my fingers following the creases Eleanor had made when she sealed it months ago. The weight of her words settled into my chest like stones, each sentence revealing layers of planning and foresight that I hadn't suspected she possessed. Richard sat quietly across from me, allowing the silence to stretch while I absorbed the implications of what she'd written. Outside his office window, the city continued its late afternoon rhythm. Cars moving through intersections, people walking home from work. The ordinary flow of life that suddenly seemed very far away from the extraordinary situation I found myself in. The leather chair creaked as I shifted, trying to find a position that would ease the tension building in my shoulders. Eleanor had always been 3 steps ahead in our marriage, anticipating problems before they arose, But this level of strategic thinking suggested she'd been preparing for something I'd been too naive or too trusting to see coming. "She knew," I said finally. Richard nodded, his expression confirming what I was beginning to understand, that Eleanor's illness hadn't clouded her judgment, but had actually sharpened her perception of the people around her. The letter felt warm in my hands, as if it still carried some trace of her presence, some echo of the conversations we'd never had about Lucas's true nature. "How long had she been planning this?" I asked. Richard opened another section of the folder, revealing documents and photographs I didn't immediately recognize, evidence of research and investigation that painted a picture of my wife as someone far more aware of our family's dynamics than I'd ever realized. 2 years, Richard said. Ever since Lucas asked her to co-sign that loan for his business venture. The memory came back to me suddenly. Eleanor mentioning something about helping Lucas with paperwork. Her explanation so casual that I'd barely paid attention at the time. Now I realized there had been layers to that conversation I'd completely missed. Warning signs that Eleanor had recognized while I'd been content to trust our son's explanations about entrepreneurial opportunities and market timing. Richard pulled out what appeared to be bank statements and loan documents, evidence of financial maneuvering that Lucas had somehow managed to conduct under Eleanor's name without my knowledge. The papers were organized with Eleanor's characteristic precision, each document labeled and dated, building a case that revealed Lucas's actions as something far more calculating than simple poor judgment. I slipped the letter into my jacket pocket, feeling the weight of it against my chest like a talisman. The decision Eleanor had made, the path she'd chosen to address Lucas's behavior, was now mine to carry forward. Richard was watching me carefully, probably trying to gauge whether I had the strength to follow through on whatever Eleanor had planned. The truth was, I wasn't sure myself whether I possessed the kind of steel-nerved resolve that this situation seemed to require. Eleanor's words echoed in my mind like a battle cry. The cruelest kindness is letting arrogance bury itself. I understood now that she hadn't just left me an inheritance, she'd left me a mission. "What do I need to do?" I asked, and Richard's smile was the first genuine expression of hope I'd seen since Eleanor's death. He began explaining the timeline, the legal procedures that would need to unfold, the carefully orchestrated revelation that Eleanor had designed to expose Lucas's actions at precisely the right moment. As he spoke, I found myself thinking about the man I'd raised, the boy who had once helped Eleanor plant marigolds in our garden and had cried when his pet hamster died. Somewhere along the way, that boy had become someone who could forge his mother's signature and speak of her death as a business opportunity. Eleanor had seen this transformation clearly while I'd been looking the other way, hoping that time and maturity would correct whatever had gone wrong. Now I realized that hope had been a luxury we couldn't afford, and the kindness I'd shown Lucas had actually been a disservice to everyone involved. The last light of day was fading as I prepared to leave Richard's office, the folder of documents secured in a briefcase that felt heavier than it should have. Eleanor's plan was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its precision. She would give Lucas exactly what he thought he wanted, just long enough for him to reveal the full extent of his betrayal to everyone who mattered. Then the truth would emerge, not as an accusation from a grieving father, but as a legal reality that couldn't be disputed or explained away. As I walked toward the elevator, I realized that tomorrow I would have to begin playing a role that Eleanor had written for me, pretending to be the confused old man that Lucas already believed me to be. But what I didn't know then was how quickly Lucas would force my hand, or how much he'd already committed to deals that depended on money he would never control. The phone rang at 7:30 the next morning. The phone's shrill ring felt like an intrusion into this sacred morning quiet. but I recognized the number on the caller ID and knew that avoiding Lucas would only delay whatever storm he was brewing. I let it ring 3 times before answering, giving myself those extra seconds to prepare for the performance Eleanor had written for me. "Morning, Dad." Lucas's voice came through the speaker with an energy that seemed inappropriate for someone who had buried his mother less than a week ago. I could hear traffic in the background, the sounds of a city waking up, which meant he was probably calling from his car during his commute to the investment firm where he worked. "I hope I didn't wake you," he continued, though his tone suggested he wouldn't have cared much if he had. The casual dismissal in his voice reminded me of the way he'd spoken to Eleanor in her final months, as if her opinions were quaint relics from a simpler time. "No, son, I've been up for a while," I said, letting a slight tremor creep into my voice. "Is everything all right?" I asked, though I suspected that Lucas's definition of all right had very little to do with grief or family healing and everything to do with financial opportunity. I could almost see him behind the wheel of his BMW, the one that Madison had insisted they lease because it made the right impression at country club events, weighing his words carefully before committing to whatever narrative he'd decided to spin. "Actually, Dad, I wanted to talk to you about some opportunities that have come up," Lucas said. And there was that word again. Opportunities. It was the same term he'd used when explaining why he needed Eleanor to co-sign various documents over the past 2 years, always framed as chances that were too good to pass up, investments that would secure the family's future. "I've already told a developer in Miami that we'll wire $2 million this week. It's a sure thing. The property will triple in value by next year." The casual way he announced this enormous financial commitment, as if $2 million was pocket change to be moved around at will, made my coffee taste bitter in my mouth. $2 million is a lot of money, son," I said. If Lucas had already committed to this developer, if he'd made promises based on an inheritance he assumed was his, then Eleanor's plan would have consequences that reached far beyond our family. But before I could say anything else, Lucas's voice cut through my careful response with the kind of impatient authority that brooked no argument. "Not when you're about to control 60, he said, and the number hung in the air between us like a challenge. $60 million, spoken as if it were already his to command, as if my role in this equation was merely ceremonial. "Dad, I know this is all overwhelming for you," he said. "But trust me when I say that sitting on that money won't do anyone any good. Mom would have wanted us to be smart about this, to make moves that would grow the wealth she worked so hard to build." The casual invocation of Eleanor's wishes, twisted to support Lucas's agenda. He was using his mother's memory as justification for exactly the kind of reckless financial behavior that had prompted her to change the will in the first place. "I'll need to think about it," I said finally. There was another pause, longer this time, and I could practically feel Lucas recalibrating on the other end of the line. "Think about it," he repeated. "Dad, I've already given them my word. The paperwork needs to be signed by Friday, or we lose the opportunity entirely." The pressure in his tone was unmistakable, the implication that my hesitation was standing between the family and financial success. It was the same tactic he'd used with Eleanor, I realized. Create urgency, frame delay as loss, make the other person feel responsible for missing out on something valuable. The doorbell rang at 2 o'clock that afternoon, just as I was finishing a lunch I hadn't really tasted. Through the front window, I could see Madison's silver Lexus in the driveway, parked at an angle that suggested she'd been in a hurry to get to my door. I took my time walking to the door, using those extra seconds to arrange my expression into something appropriately confused and slightly overwhelmed, the mask that Lucas had apparently already convinced himself was my true face. "Henry," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. I hope you don't mind me stopping by, but Lucas and I have been so worried about you." The portfolio in her hands rustled as she set it down on the coffee table. I followed her into the room, where Eleanor and I had spent countless evenings reading and watching television, where we decorated our first Christmas tree and celebrated birthdays and anniversaries, now feeling like I was a guest in my own home. "Can I get you some coffee?" I asked. Madison waved the offer away, her attention already focused on opening the portfolio and arranging its contents on the coffee table with the precision of someone conducting a business presentation. The papers she spread out were glossy and professional, full of photographs and charts that looked impressive even at a distance. "Actually, Henry, I wanted to show you something that I think could really help you during this difficult transition," she said. The brochure she placed in front of me was professionally printed on heavy paper stock, with photographs of smiling elderly people engaged in various activities that looked both wholesome and completely staged. Senior Living Community was printed across the top in elegant script, followed by smaller text about active lifestyles for today's retirees. The images showed people playing golf, painting watercolors, and gathered around dining tables that looked like something from an upscale restaurant. Everything in the photographs was clean and bright and cheerful, the kind of place that promised to solve all the problems of aging with recreational therapy and scheduled activities. "You'd be so much happier here, Henry," she said. "A smaller place, no worries about maintenance or upkeep. We could handle the house sale for you, take care of all the details." "It looks very nice," I said, slowly turning the pages. The amenities list was impressive: fitness center, library, organized trips to local attractions, chef-prepared meals. Everything designed to appeal to someone who wanted to trade independence for convenience, responsibility for entertainment. I could see the appeal, could understand how someone might find comfort in such a structured environment. But the timing of this presentation, coming so soon after Lucas's phone call about the Miami investment, made it clear that this wasn't about my happiness at all. "The waiting list is usually quite long," Madison continued, leaning forward in her chair with the intensity of someone closing a deal. "But they have an opening available immediately. We could have you moved in within 2 weeks." 2 weeks to pack up a lifetime, to abandon the home where Eleanor's presence still lingered in every room, to relocate to a place where I would be safely isolated from any business decisions that Lucas and Madison might want to make. I closed the brochure and set it down on the coffee table, my movements deliberately slow and thoughtful. 2 weeks seems very fast," I said. "Well, opportunities like this don't wait," she said, unconsciously echoing Lucas's language from our morning phone call. "And really, Henry, wouldn't it be easier to start fresh somewhere new, somewhere without so many memories?" I turned to look out the window toward Eleanor's garden, where the late-season chrysanthemums were still blooming in defiant bursts of yellow and orange. She had planted them every fall for as long as I could remember, always saying that the garden needed something beautiful to carry it through the difficult months ahead. The sight of those flowers, continuing their cycle without her, made something tight and painful expand in my chest. "I'll need to think about it," I said, the same words I'd used with Lucas. When I turned back to her, she was gathering up the brochures with movements that were just a little too sharp, a little too controlled. "Of course," she said. "But don't wait too long, Henry. Good opportunities have a way of disappearing when we're not ready to act on them." After Madison left, I sat in the growing dusk of my living room, surrounded by the evidence of their plans for my future. Financial investments I hadn't agreed to, living arrangements I hadn't requested, decisions being made about my life as if I were already incapacitated by grief or age. Eleanor's letter rustled in my pocket as I shifted in my chair, and I pulled it out to read her words again in the fading light. "Let him," she had written about Lucas's mockery, and I was beginning to understand the full scope of what she meant, tomorrow would bring the will reading, and that all of our careful performances would finally come to an end in Richard Coleman's conference room. The conference room at Coleman & Associates felt smaller than I remembered. I arrived 15 minutes early, as was my habit for important meetings, and chose the chair facing the door so I could watch Lucas and Madison when they entered. The leather portfolio beside my chair contained the documents Richard had given me yesterday, including Eleanor's letter that I'd read so many times the paper was beginning to soften at the creases. Lucas and Madison arrived exactly at 10 o'clock, their punctuality suggesting they viewed this meeting as a formality rather than a potential surprise. Lucas wore his best charcoal suit, the one he reserved for important client presentations, and his hair was perfectly styled with just enough gray at the temples to suggest wisdom and experience. Madison had chosen a navy dress that struck the perfect balance between respectful mourning and professional competence, her jewelry understated but expensive enough to signal their anticipated new status. They moved into the room with the confident ease of people who believed they already knew how this conversation would end. Lucas pulling out Madison's chair with the kind of gallant gesture that looked good in public settings. "Morning, Dad," Lucas said. "I hope you slept well." I nodded and offered the small smile. Madison settled into her chair and immediately pulled out a leather notepad, apparently prepared to take notes on whatever decisions emerged from this meeting. "We're here to support you through this, Henry," she said. "These legal matters can be so overwhelming, especially when you're still grieving." Richard entered the room carrying a thick manila folder that looked different from the standard legal documents I was accustomed to seeing. His expression was professionally neutral, but I caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested he was as prepared for this confrontation as I was. The folder made a soft thud as he placed it on the table, and I noticed Lucas's eyes immediately focus on its thickness, probably calculating how many assets would be detailed in the pages inside. "Good morning, everyone," Richard said. "Thank you all for being here. I know this is a difficult time, but Eleanor was very specific about how she wanted this process to unfold." Madison's pen was poised over her notepad, ready to record whatever numbers and percentages Richard was about to reveal. Lucas leaned back in his chair with the relaxed posture of someone who was confident about the outcome, his hands folded across his stomach. "Before we begin," Richard continued, opening the folder to reveal multiple documents arranged in careful order, "I want to remind everyone that this will was executed 3 months before Eleanor's passing, and it represents her final wishes regarding the distribution of her estate." The change was small, but noticeable. A straightening of his shoulders, a sharpening of his focus that suggested he was beginning to pay closer attention to the lawyer's tone than he had initially planned. Madison's pen had stopped moving over her notepad, suspended in mid-air, as if she was waiting for information worthy of documentation. The conference room felt charged with anticipation, like the moment before a thunderstorm, when the air pressure drops and every sound becomes amplified. Richard lifted the first document from the folder, holding it with the careful reverence that important legal papers demanded. "This is the last will and testament of Eleanor Grace Walker," he announced, his voice clear and formal. "Executed on July 15th, 3 months before her passing, and witnessed by 2 independent parties as required by state law." The date hit me like a revelation. July 15th was just 2 days after Lucas had come to dinner and spent the entire evening talking about his business ventures and the opportunities he was pursuing with Eleanor's potential help. I remembered that night clearly now. Remembered the way Eleanor had listened to his explanations with unusual intensity, asking questions that had seemed casual at the time, but now revealed themselves as careful interrogation. She had made her decision about the will's contents based on that conversation, I realized, and the timing suggested that Lucas had unknowingly provided the final evidence she needed to justify the dramatic changes she was about to implement. Richard cleared his throat and began to read from the document, his voice steady and professional as he delivered the words that Eleanor had chosen with surgical precision. "To my beloved husband Henry," Richard read, "I leave control of the estate in its entirety, including all real property, financial assets, investment accounts, and business interests, to be managed according to his judgment and distributed according to his wishes. To my son Lucas," Richard continued, his voice never wavering despite the magnitude of what he was about to reveal, "I leave the debt he created under my name, which I have since paid in full. This debt, totaling $500,000, represents loans and investments made without my knowledge or consent through forged documentation. This bequest is intended to remind him that family fortune is not a loan to gamble with, and that trust, once broken, carries consequences that extend far beyond financial loss." Lucas's chair scraped against the floor as he pushed back from the table, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and dawning horror as the implications of Eleanor's words settled into his consciousness. "That's insane!" Lucas shouted, his voice cracking with a combination of rage and desperation. His hands slammed against the conference table with enough force to make the coffee cups rattle, the sound sharp and violent in the formal atmosphere of the law office. "She can't do this. There has to be some mistake, some earlier will that takes precedence." The words tumbled out of him in a rush, each one betraying his growing understanding that the inheritance he'd been counting on, the money he'd already committed to investments, was not only gone, but had been deliberately withheld as punishment for actions he'd thought were secret. Sweat had begun to bead on his forehead, despite the cool temperature of the conference room. Madison's reaction was different but equally revealing, her composed professionalism dissolving into something much more primitive and immediate. The gold pen fell from her suddenly nerveless fingers. "Debt? What debt?" She turned to face Lucas with the kind of movement that suggested violence was being barely restrained, her perfectly styled hair whipping around her face as she sought answers from the man who had apparently been lying to her for longer than she'd realized. I watched Lucas's face drain of color as Madison's questions hit him, the confident tan that came from regular golf games at the country club suddenly looking sallow and unhealthy under the conference room lights. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly, like a fish gasping for air, as he struggled to find words that could explain or justify what Eleanor's will had just exposed. The sweat that had been beading on his forehead was now running freely down his face, and his hands trembled as he reached up to loosen his tie with movements that looked increasingly desperate. "Madison, I can explain," he started. "It wasn't supposed to matter. The money was always going to be there. I was just accessing it a little early." Richard sat quietly at the head of the table, his professional composure intact despite the chaos erupting around him, his hands folded over the remaining documents that would undoubtedly contain even more devastating details about Lucas's financial misconduct. Madison was staring at her husband with the kind of intensity that suggested she was seeing him clearly for the first time, recognizing patterns of behavior that she'd previously attributed to business acumen rather than criminal activity. Lucas turned to me with the desperate expression of a drowning man reaching for a lifeline, his eyes wide with the kind of panic that comes from watching an entire life's worth of assumptions crumble in real time. "Dad," he said, his voice breaking with emotion that might have been convincing if I hadn't heard him discussing my incompetence just days before. "You have to understand, I was trying to protect the family's interests, to make smart investments that would benefit everyone." But the pleading in his tone only served to confirm everything that Eleanor's will had just revealed about his character and his motivations. But what I didn't know then was that Richard's folder contained even more devastating evidence of Lucas's betrayal. documents that would reveal the full scope of what Eleanor had discovered and documented in the months before her death. Richard's hand moved toward a second folder that had been sitting beneath the will documents. The manila cover was thicker than the first, bulging with photographs and official documents. Lucas was still standing beside his chair, his face covered in sweat. Madison remained frozen in her seat, staring at her husband. "There's more," Richard said. He pulled out bank statements and loan documents, each one bearing official seals and signatures. Lucas's knees buckled slightly. He grabbed the back of his chair for support. "Lucas forged Eleanor's signature last year for a $500,000 investment loan through First National Bank," Richard said. "Eleanor discovered the forgery when the bank called to verify some details about her assets. She paid the loan in full to protect the family's credit rating, but she also documented everything." Richard lifted a photocopy of a loan application, holding it so Madison could see the signature line clearly marked with Eleanor's name. The handwriting looked authentic to anyone who didn't know my wife's actual script. Madison's face had gone completely white. She turned toward Lucas with mechanical movements. "You told me it was secured," she said. "You said the bank approved it based on your mother's assets, that she had agreed to back your investments." Her hands were shaking as she reached for the loan documents. I watched her recognize the forgery for what it was. Lucas's mouth opened and closed several times before any sound emerged. "Madison, you have to understand," he said. "The investment opportunities were real. The returns would have covered everything. There was never supposed to be any risk." The sweat that had been beading on his forehead was now soaking through his expensive shirt, creating dark stains. Madison was staring at him with an expression I had never seen before. Richard pulled out another document, this one bearing the letterhead of a private investigator. "Your mother didn't just discover the forgery accidentally," he said. "She suspected something was wrong when Lucas began pressing her to update her will and consolidate her assets in ways that would give him easier access to her accounts." The investigator's report was thick with photographs and bank records. I felt a chill run through me as I realized that Eleanor had been living with the knowledge of Lucas's betrayal for months. Madison's voice, when it finally emerged, sounded hollow and distant. "How long?" she asked. "How long have you been doing this?" Lucas tried to reach for her hand, but she pulled away from his touch. Her movement was sharp and decisive. "Madison, I can explain." "How long?" she repeated. The gold wedding ring on her finger caught the fluorescent light. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Richard opened another section of the folder, revealing more documents and photographs. Bank records showing a pattern of suspicious transactions. Copies of documents bearing Eleanor's forged signature on multiple occasions. A timeline that stretched back over 2 years. The $500,000 was just the most recent incident, Richard said. Eleanor's investigation revealed at least 3 other instances of forged signatures on financial documents. Lucas staggered backward until he hit the wall. His expensive suit was wrinkled and stained with sweat. "That's not possible," he said. I only did it once, just the one time when the Miami opportunity came up." "Here's a loan application from 18 months ago," Richard said. "Another for a business line of credit. And this one for a home equity loan against your mother's house." Madison stood up from her chair. Her movements were controlled and purposeful. 2 years, she said. "We've been married 8 years, and you've been stealing from your mother for 2 of them." "It wasn't stealing," Lucas said. "It was borrowing against my inheritance, money that was always going to be mine anyway." "You forged her signature," Madison said. "The bank required documentation." "You forged her signature." Lucas's face was pale and slick with sweat. His hands trembled as he reached up to loosen his tie. "I was protecting our future," he said, "making investments that would benefit the whole family." Madison gathered her purse and notepad with sharp, efficient movements. 8 years, she said. 8 years of marriage, and I never knew who I was actually married to. Lucas pushed himself away from the conference table with violence that sent his chair rolling backward until it hit the wall with a sharp bang. His face had cycled through shock and denial and was now settling into desperate rage. "Dad, you can fix this," he shouted. "You have control now. You can transfer the money to me. You can make this right." I looked at my son, this man who had forged his mother's signature, who had spoken of her death as a business opportunity. "Your mother already fixed it, son," I said. Lucas stared at me as if I had struck him. His face registered shock that I might choose justice over family loyalty. Madison was moving toward the door, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. The sound had a different quality now, final and absolute. Lucas spun toward his wife with increasingly frantic movements. His hands reached out toward her. "Madison, wait. We can work this out. We can figure something out together," he said. "The Miami deal is still good. There are other investors, other opportunities." Madison paused at the conference room door. Her hand was on the brass handle. She turned back to look at Lucas one final time. The expression on her face was not anger or hatred, but complete indifference. "Don't contact me," she said. "My attorney will be in touch about the divorce proceedings." The door closed behind her with a soft click. Lucas stood in the middle of the conference room, his expensive suit wrinkled and stained with sweat. He stared at the closed door. Richard began gathering the documents spread across the table. His movements were careful and methodical. I remained in my chair, feeling the weight of Eleanor's letter in my pocket. The morning sun was higher now, streaming through the conference room windows and casting everything in harsh, clear light. Lucas turned back to me with one final attempt. "This isn't over," he said. "There are ways to contest a will, ways to prove mental incompetence, ways to show that she wasn't thinking clearly when she made these decisions." Richard looked up from his papers. "Your mother was examined by 3 independent physicians in the month before she executed this will," he said. "All of them certified her mental competence. She also had the will videotaped with 2 witnesses present who can testify to her state of mind." Lucas's face went completely white. "She knew," he said. "She knew what I was going to say, what I was going to do." "Yes," I said. "She knew." Lucas staggered toward the door. His hand fumbled with the brass handle before he finally managed to open it. He walked out without looking back. Richard and I sat in the silence that followed. Through the windows, I could see the morning traffic building on Main Street. People heading to jobs and appointments that would continue regardless of what had just unfolded in this room. "What happens now?" I asked. Richard gathered the last of the documents and placed them back in the folder. "Now," he said, "the consequences begin." But what neither of us knew then was how quickly those consequences would spread through every corner of Lucas's carefully constructed life, destroying not just his finances but his reputation, his marriage, and his place in the community that had known him since childhood. The phone rang at 7:30 Tuesday morning. Mrs. Henderson's voice came through the receiver with unusual excitement. "Henry, you won't believe what's happening at the country club," she said. "There's a tow truck in the parking lot, and they're hooking up Lucas's car right in front of everyone." I thanked her and hung up. The image formed in my mind. Lucas's silver BMW being dragged away, while the Tuesday morning golf crowd watched from the clubhouse windows. At the grocery store that afternoon, Mrs. Patterson approached me in the produce section. Her eyes were bright with curiosity. "I heard there was some trouble with Eleanor's estate," she said. "Such a shame when family matters become so complicated." I nodded and murmured something about legal complexities. The weight of unspoken speculation filled every conversation, every sympathetic glance from people who had known Eleanor. Mr. Davis from the hardware store was more direct when I stopped by for screws. "Heard your boy got himself into some financial trouble," he said. "Eleanor always was sharp about money matters. She wouldn't have cut him out without good reason." The evening news brought confirmation. Janet Morrison mentioned during her business segment that local investment advisor Lucas Walker was facing significant financial difficulties following irregularities in his business practices. I turned off the television and sat in the gathering dusk. The silence Eleanor's absence had created filled the room. Richard Coleman called just after dinner. "The Miami developer called today," he said. "Apparently Lucas had committed to wiring $2 million by Friday, and when the money didn't materialize, they started asking questions." "What did you tell them?" I asked. "The truth. They're considering legal action for breach of contract." I hung up the phone. Eleanor's justice was extending far beyond what any of us had anticipated. The whispers started immediately. I heard them at the post office, at the bank, in the church parking lot after Sunday service. His mom covered his debts? No wonder she cut him out. $500,000 in forgery. Can you imagine? That poor Eleanor, dealing with that kind of betrayal from her own son. The conversation stopped when people saw me, but I caught the fragments, the pieces of my family's story being dissected and analyzed by neighbors who had watched Lucas grow up. The divorce papers arrived on Thursday, delivered by courier service. Madison had moved quickly. The envelope was thick with legal language, but the essential message was clear. She wanted nothing from Lucas except her freedom. I signed as a witness where required. The papers included a restraining order prohibiting Lucas from contacting Madison directly. Lucas's termination from Hartwell Investment Group came 2 days later. Mrs. Henderson called again. "They escorted him out of the building," she said. "Apparently the partners held an emergency meeting once they learned about the forgery charges. They couldn't risk having their firm associated with that kind of scandal." The bankruptcy filing appeared in the legal notices section the following week, a small paragraph buried among routine announcements. "Lucas Walker, 40, of Maple Street, has filed for Chapter 7, bankruptcy protection, citing liabilities in excess of assets." I read the notice multiple times. My son had gone from planning to control $60 million to financial insolvency in 3 weeks. The address listed was not his house with Madison, but a small apartment complex across town. The social isolation followed swiftly. The golf foursome that had included him for years suddenly had a permanent 4th player. The charity board quietly removed his name from their letterhead. The country club suggested he might want to consider alternative recreational options. The criminal investigation began in the 4th week. A brief statement from the district attorney's office said they were reviewing allegations of financial fraud involving forged documents and identity theft. Richard called to inform me that investigators had requested copies of all the documents Eleanor had compiled. "They'll use this evidence to build their case," he said. "How long before they file charges?" I asked. 6 months, maybe less. The evidence is overwhelming." The house on Maple Street went up for sale the following month. A "for sale" sign appeared on the front lawn like a tombstone. The asking price was significantly below market value. I drove by one evening. The windows were dark, accumulated mail on the front porch. The garden Madison had maintained with such pride was withering without care. The final blow came when the country club's board voted to revoke Lucas's membership. The letter cited connoisseur unbecoming of club standards as grounds for permanent expulsion. I imagined Lucas receiving that letter in whatever small apartment he now called home, surrounded by the wreckage of his life, finally understanding what his choices had cost him. 2 months later, I was working in Eleanor's garden when Mrs. Henderson called over the fence. "Haven't seen Lucas around lately," she said. "Word is he left town." "Where did he go?" I asked. "Nobody knows. Just packed up and disappeared one night." I continued pulling weeds from Eleanor's rose bed. The autumn air was crisp, the last blooms struggling against the coming winter. 3 years passed before I learned where my son had gone, and whether the man who had forged his mother's signature had learned anything from watching his entire world collapse. The letter was waiting in my mailbox on a Tuesday morning in September, mixed between a utility bill and grocery store advertisements. The envelope was plain white, no return address, with my name written in handwriting I hadn't seen in 3 years. I recognized the script immediately, the same careful cursive Eleanor had taught Lucas when he was 7 years old, practicing letters at our kitchen table. My hands shook as I tore open the envelope, standing right there beside the mailbox with Mrs. Henderson's curious eyes watching from her front porch. The paper inside was simple notebook stock, the kind you might buy at any convenience store, and the words were written in blue ink that had smudged slightly in places. "Dad, I know I disgraced myself. I'm rebuilding from nothing in Texas. I'm not asking for money, just a chance to prove I learned. Lucas." The message was brief, maybe 20 words total, but each one carried weight that made my chest tighten. I read it 3 times before folding it carefully and slipping it into my shirt pocket, the same pocket where I still carried Eleanor's handkerchief. Mrs. Henderson had gone back inside, probably disappointed that she couldn't read the contents over my shoulder. I walked back to the house slowly, my legs feeling heavier with each step, carrying news that I had both hoped for and dreaded for 3 years. The September air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and Eleanor's chrysanthemums were beginning to bloom along the garden path she had planted with such care. I found myself walking to the wood shop behind the house, a small building where I'd spent countless hours over the years working on projects that Eleanor would admire and use throughout our home. The shop smelled of sawdust and wood stain, familiar scents that had always calmed my mind when the world became too complicated to navigate. In the corner sat an unfinished chair, one I'd started building the week after Eleanor's funeral, but had never found the motivation to complete. The wood was solid oak, cut and shaped with the precision that 40 years of carpentry had taught me, but the joints remained unglued, the pieces waiting for assembly that might never come. I sat down at my workbench with Lucas's letter in my hands, reading the words again in the afternoon light that filtered through the dusty windows. Texas meant he was far away, farther than I had imagined when he disappeared from our small town 3 years ago. The phrase, "from nothing," suggested he had lost everything that remained after the bankruptcy and criminal investigation that had followed Eleanor's revelations. I wondered what kind of work he was doing, what kind of life he was building in a place where no one knew his name or his history. The Lucas who had written this letter sounded different from the man who had shouted at me in Richard's conference room, demanding that I fix what Eleanor had broken. But letters could lie as easily as spoken words, and I had learned not to trust my son's ability to sound sincere when it served his purposes. Still, something about the brevity of his message, the lack of elaborate explanations or justifications, made me think that maybe, finally, he was beginning to understand what he had lost. Eleanor's workshop visits had been one of the small rituals of our marriage, moments when she would bring me coffee or iced tea and watch me work on whatever project had captured my attention. She never offered advice about the woodworking itself. That was my domain. But she would share observations about the garden or neighborhood news or plans for upcoming holidays that needed furniture repairs or improvements. Those conversations had been the backbone of our partnership, the daily exchanges that built a life together one small moment at a time. Now I sat alone in the silence that her death had created, holding a letter from the son who had broken her heart, but who might possibly be trying to find his way back to something resembling decency. I set the letter down on the workbench and picked up a piece of sandpaper, running it along the arm of the unfinished chair with movements that were automatic and soothing. The wood responded to the pressure, becoming smoother with each stroke, transforming under the careful attention that all worthwhile things required. Lucas had never shown patience for this kind of work, had always wanted immediate results, rather than the slow progress that produced something lasting and strong. But perhaps 3 years of consequences had taught him something about the value of patient effort, about building something real rather than something that merely looked impressive on the surface. The afternoon light was fading now, casting long shadows across the workshop floor, and I realized I had been sanding the same piece of wood for an hour without conscious thought. The phone rang as I was cleaning up the workshop, putting tools back in their designated places with the careful order that Eleanor had always appreciated. I almost didn't answer, expecting a telemarketer or neighbor with news I didn't particularly want to hear, but something made me pick up the receiver on the 4th ring. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, a woman with a slight Texas accent who identified herself as a social worker from Dallas. My heart began to race before she even explained why she was calling, some instinct telling me that this conversation was connected to the letter that was still folded in my shirt pocket. She asked if I was Henry Walker, if I had a son named Lucas, and when I confirmed both facts, she paused in a way that made me brace for bad news. "Your son asked me to call you," she said. "He's been working with our job placement program for people transitioning out of difficult circumstances. He wanted you to know that he's been clean and sober for 8 months now, and that he's found steady work at a construction company. He also wanted you to know that he's been attending counseling sessions to understand the choices he made." The words came through the phone line like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man, offering hope but requiring trust that I wasn't sure I possessed. Lucas had asked someone else to make this call rather than picking up the phone himself, which could mean he was genuinely humble, or simply that he was still manipulating situations to his advantage. The social worker's voice was kind but professional, carrying the tone of someone who had made many such calls and understood the complexity of family relationships damaged by betrayal and addiction. I thanked her for calling and hung up, standing in my kitchen as darkness settled over the house that Eleanor and I had shared for so many years. The letter from Lucas lay on the counter where I had placed it, 20 words that might represent genuine change, or might be just another version of the lies he had told throughout his adult life. The social worker's call added weight to his claim about rebuilding from nothing, but I had learned not to trust easily when it came to my son's promises and declarations. Still, for the first time in 3 years, I felt something that might have been hope stirring in my chest, tentative and fragile, but undeniably present. Eleanor had always believed that people could change if the consequences of their actions became too painful to ignore, and perhaps Lucas had finally reached that point in his journey. I walked to the window and looked out at Eleanor's garden, where the last roses of the season were blooming despite the cooling nights that warned of winter's approach. She had planted those roses the year before her death, choosing varieties that would bloom late into the fall and provide beauty when most other flowers had surrendered to the cold. The metaphor wasn't lost on me. Sometimes the most meaningful growth happens when conditions are harsh, when survival requires real strength rather than artificial support. I didn't know if Lucas had truly changed, if the man who had written that letter was someone I could trust or forgive. But I knew that Eleanor had been right about the power of consequences to teach lessons that kindness alone could never provide. The cruelest kindness had indeed been letting arrogance bury itself, and now I had to decide whether the person who had emerged from that burial was worth the risk of believing in again. If you've ever wondered whether someone in your life deserves a second chance after betraying your trust, what would it take for you to believe their change was real? Share your thoughts below.